Right. So, as I said before, I am Liz. Welcome to the first film program of the month, which is Midnight Movies, or as it's called on the schedule, the Midnight Movie. So actually, before I go to the slideshow, you can put it into the chat or raise your hand. Who here has ever been to a midnight movie? Oh, no one. Okay, so this is going to be fun. But oh, I saw someone do a thumbs up. All right, someone has. All right, I'm seeing a few more people. Also, has any, okay, someone said Rocky Horror. Oh, that's getting discussed. All right, so we have some people familiar with what this is. All right, with that, oh, someone did Troll too. Ooh. The other one that you mentioned, Christopher, we are going to discuss, but that is, we'll get there, don't worry. Todd and I both have some stories from those screenings. But with that, we're gonna start the slideshow. All right, so midnight movies. I chose Rocky Horror because if anybody thinks of midnight movies, Rocky Horror is the first thing that comes to mind for good reason, as we'll go over later. It is kind of the quintessential midnight movie. So what is a midnight movie? So this definition applies not only to cinema as in theaters, but also to television. So these are movies that were usually low budget. They were creative or weird, usually transgressive in a way, and they were shown at midnight on TV stations as a way to have midnight programming. But for theaters, it was a way to get the kids in and to try to attract either the younger crowd, i.e. not the people in like their 30s and up, but to try to attract younger kids. And thinking about in like the 50s and 60s, they're trying to get the beatniks, they're trying to get the art crowd, they're kind of trying to get the hippies. So it's just basically a way to attract a different demographic. And there's going to be a lot of cities coming up for this because cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, and also some smaller cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, and of course like places like Washington, DC. These are the places where there were a lot of independent theaters and also a larger group of people who would fit kind of the midnight movie demographic. You wouldn't have a midnight movie theater in Derry, New Hampshire in the 60s, or probably not. Maybe I am wrong. I should probably ask Aaron about that. So they became popular starting in the 50s. This was also when we started to see more monster movies again. We started to see, kind of hokey B movies, and exploitation really start to rise up. And it remained a part of cinemas, especially in cities, through the 1970s and into the 1980s. So when I asked what is a midnight movie, there's really no one way to describe it. And when I asked if anyone had been to a midnight movie, the answers I had were three fairly different films. There's no one genre for a midnight movie. It's more the audience chooses the midnight movie, and the movie itself is defined more by the cult following it has. And as I do note here, not every cult movie is a midnight movie, although they may have midnight repertory screenings. But most midnight movies from back in the day are cult movies. And if you've ever been to a screening, you will know this, but if you haven't, many midnight movies will come with some sort of audience participation. You can cheer, you can respond back to the screen, or sometimes you can throw spoons and footballs. I should note that there are some theaters that are now trying to cut back on that, Todd. If you'd like to tell, you saw the Warriors at Coolidge, right?
Yeah, that was actually, admittedly, this wasn't quite for the same reason that they discouraged some of the behaviors with stuff like The Room, which we'll get to.
The Room, Todd.
The thing with the Warriors is, so one of the rituals of the Coolidge Midnights is they will start by asking who has seen this for the first time. And they had a lot of newcomers to the Warriors, so that was framed as more of we got a lot of people seeing this the first time, so as a courtesy to them, just watch the movie. I know it's tempting to yell along with it, but let these people enjoy the film.
Yeah. Whereas if Mark's running the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Mark Anastasio is the guy who does the special programming at Coolidge. Rocky Horror, it's a little more allowed to do the call and response to the films, to Rocky Horror, versus when he does his midnights, he will try to do there are some people here for the first time. Please practice some decorum. So early midnight movies. It's hard to pin down what the first exactly is, but most of the books I've read and the stuff I've read on this points to Todd Browning's Freaks. So if you've been to a couple of my programs, you've heard about Freaks. And this is Todd Browning's tale of the cast of circus freaks and their betrayal and the fact that they get back at that person. Freaks, when it came out in the 1930s, was a massive, it had a lot of controversy. It featured people who had real disabilities, they had deformities. So you had people who had microcephaly, you had people who didn't have arms or legs, you had hirsute women. The main character is a dwarf and he's played by an actual little person. And people in the 1930s were just really freaked out by that. They thought it was obscene, they thought it was abhorrent. And also keep in mind, when this movie came out, this was a time when people with disabilities or deformities, they were usually in institutions or kept away from society, or they were circus freaks and they were there to be gawked at rather than the heroes of the film. So it has all the makings for what you would now consider to be kind of a midnight cult following. So it has a cast that's kind of sensational and a sensational plot. So the main character, the little person, he falls in love with the trapeze artist, but turns out she's trying to kill him for his inheritance. How a little person working in a circus has an inheritance, I don't know, but good for him. They end up catching her and having revenge, which again, another controversial thing for this film. And if you have not seen the final frames of this movie, I would recommend just going to watch Freaks. It's about an hour long. And you get to absorb the full shock of that ending. But this was the first one that in like the 50s, people were like, oh, you've got to see this. This is like nothing you've ever seen in cinema. Because you have to remember, about 20 years had passed since this movie had first aired. So there was a whole new group of people discovering it. The other one, another 30s film, is Reefer Madness. So we all know what that movie is. It was a very sincere anti-marijuana propaganda piece, but it started to get ironic enjoyment. So the idea of like hipsters and enjoying bad things ironically, it did not begin with people in Brooklyn in the aughts. It was way back in the 50s. So those are like the two kind of, in terms of chronological, probably our first like midnight movies. And then in 1957, The Curse of Frankenstein, which was a Hammer production. Todd, can you just give a brief explanation what Hammer is for people who might not have been to our horror programs?
Hammer was basically the quintessential British horror production company for like the 60s and 70s. They're the company that made Christopher Lee a star. They were the ones that really turned Dracula and Frankenstein into like the big horror markets they were for decades. Mm-hmm. And a big part of why Dracula holds one of the records, one of the most featured fictional characters in film.
Mm-hmm. So that was a movie. So The Curse of Frankenstein was one of the first movies to kind of take off at like a midnight showing. And this wasn't trying to get like a cult market in. They just kind of figured, oh, hey, we'll play this Dracula, this Frankenstein movie at midnight, and maybe we'll get some of the teenagers to come. So not quite looking for like the artsy well, not hipstery, but the artsy beatniky demographic. This is more looking for teenagers. And then, of course, the rise of exploitation films really led to the rise of midnight showings, mainly because, if we show it at midnight, we won't have as many people pearl clutching because they'll likely be all in bed at that point in time. And also they could get around some rules, as we'll actually see a little later. Some theaters in New York would show these movies not by saying their name, but by saying a surprise screening or a secret screening. So We cannot talk about the Midnight Movie without talking about the Rocky Horror Picture Show. As I said before, it is the quintessential midnight movie. When you say cult film, you think of Rocky Horror Picture Show. When you think midnight movie, you think Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's also, I mean, Todd, I've aired this grievance to you before, but that this was back in the early aughts when Entertainment Weekly did that like 50 greatest cult movies ever, and they put Rocky Horror Picture Show at number 2. I was like, what in the they put Spinal Tap at number 1, which Spinal Tap is great, but it really felt like they're like, well, everyone expects Rocky Horror at number 1.
There's a reason everyone expects it.
Exactly. There's a reason. But yeah, also confession, I have never been to a live Rocky Horror Picture Show.
I have.
I was about to say, Todd has. I've seen photos. But yeah, I have never been to one of the, I've seen it a lot. I was really into it in high school. Because again, high school growing up in the suburbs, I had never seen a movie like this. But yeah, I have never been to one. And every time I want to, there is something schedule-wise that just screws it up. And I don't know what the universe has against me seeing a live showing of this. But anyway, Rocky Horror Picture Show did not begin as a film. It was originally a stage play written by Richard O'Brien, who, if you've seen the movie, he is Riff Raff. It was a moderately successful stage production. It had a little bit of a following, so they decided, let's make this into a movie. And they got a cast, I mean, of, I would say, up-and-comers. Like Susan Sarandon was not the star she was even in the 1980s when she made this. Barry Bostwick was still relatively unknown. Tim Curry, I think, was only theater work. If anything, Little Nell might have had the most, for depending on where you were in Britain, she might have had the most recognition because she kind of ran with the art circles. And she is actually in another really fun British cult film called Jubilee. It was released in the Criterion Collection. Try to find it if you can.
There's also Charles Gray.
What?
Charles Gray, the criminologist, a big character actor at the time.
Yeah, so if anything, they were probably the most like known actors. And it's weird to look at this movie that bombed with mainstream audiences and critics when it first came out as kind of being a launch pad for some of these people. But yeah, comes out 1975. The audiences do not get it. They're very put off, unsure of what to make of it. And it is a weird little movie if you go into this not knowing what you're getting. But at the Waverly Theater in New York City, the owner said, like, okay, let's try to show this and see what happens. And it becomes a hit. People start to find it, they see it, and they start to come back. And again, this is 1970s. Do you know what did not exist back then as a way for you to watch a movie over and over again? VCRs, DVD players were a twinkle in technology's eye. So the only way you could watch a movie again is hope it's on television, which chances were Rocky Horror might not be on TV, or go to the cinema again. So people would love it and would keep going back. And then this is when the audience participation started to develop because people had seen it so many times, they would start to add their own jokes in. That's when we started people, I can't quite repeat the names, but when she goes, "Hi, I'm Brad Majors," there's a response there, and "I'm Janet Weiss," there's a response there. People would start to make this stuff up. People would start to dress up. There would be people who would go dance on stage and sing along. And rather than that being seen as disruptive, that was seen as like, oh, this is a very special thing that comes with a midnight showing of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And it has endured for decades. We are actually getting into, I cannot believe this, the 50th anniversary of the Rocky Horror Picture Show coming up in a few years. And it actually is, since it is pretty consistently at some time or another getting played in either a major cinema for like an anniversary showing or repertory screenings or midnight shows, the Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of, if not the longest running movie to have a theatrical release. Not bad for a movie that bombed in 1975. And This is not a New York theater. There's a theater in Milwaukee, Wisconsin called the Oriental Theater, and it has had consistent midnight showings for over 40 years. I think the only thing that disrupted it was COVID. So how is that for longevity? And again, there's a reason why, yes, it's the obvious choice, but we all see Rocky Horror Picture Show is the greatest cult movie of all time. So moving on to a movie I have not seen a midnight showing of either. In fact, before this past Saturday, I had only seen it one time and it was in college and it was enough. Eraserhead by David Lynch. So I'm going to let Todd really take the reins on this, but before I would like to just give a little bit of background. So this movie was made over the course of 7 years by David Lynch, just famed, peculiar filmmaker. I respect David Lynch as an artist. A lot of David Lynch's output, I just don't think it's for me. So it was distributed by Libra Films, which is owned by Ben Barenholtz, who we're going to see a lot over the course of this program. He owned a number of theaters and he also distributed theaters. And he kind of just had an eye for what could be a midnight hit, because he also distributed King of Hearts and El Topo, which we'll get to. So this movie comes out, mainstream reaction's negative. I frankly cannot say I blame them. It is not a very accessible movie, but Barenholtz looked at this and he saw potential. And there's this great quote. It's from this book called Midnight Movies. It is by Jay Hoberman and Jonathan Rosenbaum. We do have it at the Jury Library if you want to read it. And he says, and this is something we'll kind of come back to later in the program. Some people think that you can create a cult film, which is nonsense. You can create the atmosphere where, if there is the possibility for something to become a cult film, it will flourish. But becoming a cult film is concerned, you don't know. Except for Eraserhead. Eraserhead was a gut feeling. So this movie in both New York and LA, and San Francisco, and I think in DC too, had stayed at theaters for 3.5 years for midnight showings. Again, now with movies coming out in theaters and getting on demand within a month, unheard of. But Todd, I will let you talk about Eraserhead a little more in terms of what this movie is about, because
so if I had to pitch this with a single blurb, Eraserhead it's the product of David Lynch's own time becoming a father, and the film is basically 90 minutes of all of his worst distilled fears of courtship and parenthood that are equal parts alien and frightening and also horrifically relatable. Like, watching it this past time, I was looking going, in my 20s, I watched this as oh God, what am I watching? I'm watching it this time going, this is making so much sense, it's honestly kind of scaring me.
That's my feeling too, although eventually I'm just kind of like, yep, this is still weird, still too weird for me.
To give an idea, that thing on the pill, so Jack Nance is Henry Spencer, the film's somewhat kind of weird protagonist. He's the one pictured up there. The thing on the pillow, we find out, is his child. He went out with a girl named Mary. It turned out they had been close. She became pregnant, and it's very telling. She goes, "We don't even know if it is a child." And they wind up having to move in together. Eventually, she can't take anymore. She leaves, and it's him left with this thing, and all of his fears basically causing him to slowly lose his mind over the course, the last 2 acts of the movie.
Didn't you call it what did you call it? It's a version of the American Dream.
It's almost like a nightmarish take on the American Dream, where it's you go out with your sweetheart, you settle down, you have a family, and in this version, everything goes horribly wrong. They're miserable together. They're living in it's oh God, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. Again, the world they're living in is it is a nightmare version of an industry town where you constantly hear the factory in the background at all times.
And somehow this was a movie that played for 3.5 years and everyone would go to see it because there wasn't much like it at the time. This was a very unique take on parenthood, on the American dream. And just it's not something you'd seen in cinema at that point. So it really was kind of a WTF am I watching? You've got to go see this.
I mean, even now you don't see much like it. It's kind of one of those often imitated, never duplicated films.
Yeah, twice was enough, but that's beside the point.
Still hanging on to that Blu-ray.
That's fine. On to another thing that Todd has seen, but I have not. El Topo by Alejandro Jodorowsky. If you're familiar with the name Alejandro Jodorowsky, but you haven't heard of El Topo, you've likely heard of the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune, which was about this director's failed attempt to direct an adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. As Todd can attest, we finally got a good version with Denis Villeneuve last year. So yay, something finally happened.
Well, still keeping fingers crossed we get that second half, but we'll see. They've at least announced it.
They said yes.
It's more of, I'm not going to leave the sigh of relief until it's out yet.
Okay. But Alejandro Jodorowsky, he's a Mexican director. He didn't even try to distribute this movie in Mexico. He just went to New York with the print. And I'm not kidding. He literally packed it in a bag and went up to New York and just tried to tell people like, hey, you want my print? You want this movie? This movie's going to be weird. Because in the 70s, there was this market for like just strange stuff. So the management of movies said that this movie had to be shown at midnight because, quote, it was a film too heavy to be shown any other way. And then it became a hit. It ran from December of 1970 through June of 1971. At one point, it played 7 nights a week. And once again, Ben Barenholtz, he owned 2 theaters. He owned the Elgin. I think he owned a few other theaters, but he first saw El Topo at the Museum of Modern Art. That was one of the first places to really be receptive to Jodorowsky. They saw, at the very least, they're like, this is a piece of art. We should show it. And he persuaded the film's distributor to be like, let me make this a midnight show. And this is a quote from Barenholtz. By the end of the first week, we were selling out every seat in the theater. 600 seats. Again, this is a New York City theater every night, and it lasted more than a year at the Elgin. So Todd, what is El Topo even about?
So I will say this up front, as far going off the idea of a film too heavy to be shown any other way, there is a trifecta of films by Jodorowsky that could apply to. It's El Topo, The Holy Mountain, and Santa Sangre, although this is definitely the most successful of the 3. And part of that's, in this case, part of the subject, it's like, it's some of the just on-screen content. Like, there are some fairly low budget, but still fairly graphic kills. The climax of the film involves the massacre of a town full of essentially various degrees of deformed, armed, disabled people, which it goes between, oh, what the heck am I watching? And oh God, this is happening.
Yeah.
But the film itself, I think Wikipedia best summed up when they described it as an acid western. Like, the main character, the titular El Topo, is a gunslinger who he travels with his son, and he goes on a weird spiritual journey where at first he meets up with a woman who sends him out to seek out these 4 great gunmen. He takes them out, and then he basically has this whole weird spiritual awakening. He reinvents himself as this traveling priest figure. And then it jumps ahead to, like, his son is now a priest. He is part of this whole weird community of deformed people. And I'm not going to go too much further into because then it gets into spoiling the ending, but it is equal parts just very surreal and very spiritual.
Yeah. And what's interesting is this is happening alongside New American cinema in Hollywood and New York. So that kind of begins in the late 60s, early 70s. But with that, we're also seeing creatives in other countries starting to be like, okay, weird stuff is happening. The 60s really set the stage for like weirdness and underground and avant-garde films. So we now see people like Jodorowsky responding to it and kind of being like, all right, I'm going to do my own thing. And the same is said for David Lynch. A lot of the avant-garde filmmakers of the 50s and 60s laid that groundwork. And the midnight movie circuit really reaped the benefits. So on to Pink Flamingos. Y'all knew this one was going to be on here. A lot of John Waters movies, similar to Jodorowsky and even David Lynch. They all of this stuff kind of has a midnight quality, but Pink Flamingos was a watershed moment in cinema in terms of what you could put on screen and get away with showing, and how people responded to it. There was definitely outrage and people thinking this was disgusting, but there were also people like, I have never seen anything like this in my life. This is genius. This is hysterical. This is this is a new chapter in cinema being written. One of my uncle, I remember talking to him the first time after I went to Camp John Waters for the first time, and he goes, I remember seeing Pink Flamingos in the theater in 1977. He's like, we could not believe what we were looking at. And if you don't know what Pink Flamingos is about, it stars Divine, the legendary Divine, as Babs Johnson. She lives with her friend and her son in a trailer, and she holds the title of the filthiest person alive. And the plot's very threadbare. It's basically her fighting with this couple called the Marbles for the title of filthiest person alive. You also have a just like a powerhouse performance by Divine. It is the definition of a star-making role. Pink Flamingos was not John Waters' first midnight hit, though. His previous movie, his second full-length feature, the first full-length feature that really felt like a movie, Multiple Maniacs, Mike Getz, who owned Cinema Theater, he picked that up and then ended up going to 16 major cities, kind of this, and again, it kind of had this word of mouth, and it had this notoriety to it, this, you will not believe what you're seeing in this. I mean, now, if we had to draw a comparison, it would be stuff on the internet of like, oh, have you seen this YouTube video or this viral video? I can't believe this is really happening. Or I guess I should say, like, Todd, what would be a cinematic equivalent today of like I can't believe they're putting this on screen?
Nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, my first gut answer is a Serbian film, and not for great reasons.
I mean, I can't judge. My first thought was The Human Centipede.
Yeah, that too. Well, and I think there's a really marked difference between something like Pink Flamingos and something like those movies where all three of these. Yep.
One other comes to mind. I can never remember the director's name. The guy who did Rubber.
Oh yeah.
Because he's done several of those kind of strange films where it's like, you get that, there was Deerskin, and he had the other one like last year.
Yeah, but like movies like The Human Centipede, they're made to shock, but they're also made to like, they're made to discuss and elicit feelings of disgust. And while Pink Flamingos also is trying to elicit some feelings from you, there is a fun and a joy in Pink Flamingos. As it says right here, you know, there's drag queen humor, there's edginess of underground comics, there's P.T. Barnum, there's, you know, we didn't have the word for it yet, but there's punk in there. But it's overall a fun watch where stuff like The Human Centipede is just dour. I'm like, this is just gross. But Pink Flamingos comes out. There's a lot of stuff that happens in it, which I don't think I can talk about in a library setting, certainly not while being recorded. But that comes out. It has its premiere at the University of Baltimore, which, you know, it's a John Waters movie. Where else is it going to be? And it was actually picked up by New Line for distribution, which New Line was someone who gave John Waters a lot of both push and leeway. They also gave him, for Polyester, some real money to make a real movie eventually. But this premiered in New York in 1973 at the Orpheum. It later went to the Elgin. And again, this was a word of mouth. It had 5 nights a week showings. And again, it was all this idea of, I can't believe this is happening on screen. Again, just to go back to what my uncle said, just, we couldn't believe what we were seeing. But he said that not with disgust, but with a smile on his face. And again, Pink Flamingos is in poor taste, but you're gonna laugh and you're gonna have fun. And Todd, a couple years ago, this was pre-COVID, but we went to go to a midnight showing of Pink Flamingos. You had never seen it before. So how was your midnight experience with this?
I think the most work-safe way to put it was spending large chunks of it half doubled over in the seat, laughing amid mutterings of what am I watching?
Can confirm I was next to you. It was laughter and What am I looking at? Also, there was a great feature that we saw, which was some like special like deleted scenes that John introduced, and there was one where it was Pat Moran playing a character, which again, this is John Waters, so he does this to shock, playing a character called Patty Hitler. And the way John Waters ended this was life-affirming characters. That's what I'm all about. I mean, the man has a sense of humor. It's not for everyone, but I think the reason movies like Pink Flamingos live on is they're there to ultimately make you laugh. Moving on to Night of the Living Dead, a movie that I did not know was a midnight film. I have always, as a horror fan, known of Night of the Living Dead not only as George Romero's first movie, but as the movie that changed horror as a genre forever. There really wasn't a movie made after 1969 might be a push, but after the night, like post 1970s, that did not have a little bit of Night of the Living Dead in its DNA. It was a shocking film. Roger Ebert wrote in his review where he goes like, there were children at this screening and they were really freaking out at this. And yeah, it's not a movie for kids. This was also kind of in between before like the MPAA got started and when the Hays Code wasn't there, so there really wasn't a rating for it. So again, parents saw the kind of hokey title Night of the Living Dead and figured this will be fine for kids. No, it's not. So George Romero makes this movie outside of Pittsburgh and he goes to New York City to screen it for Columbia. But they thought, this film studio thought like, oh, we can't market it. It's black and white. No one's going to want to see it. Of course, at the time, most pictures are being made in color at this point. But Walter Reed, who owned a theater chain, he picked it up for distribution. It was on a double bill with a film called Slaves. 3 years later, it has its first midnight screening in DC in 1971. And there was a 25-week midnight run at the Walter Reed Theater in Greenwich Village, and then midnight runs at the Bijou in the Waverly. Just a sad note, a lot of these movies, theaters, if you go to New York City, they're no longer there. It's sad, but it's, thankfully they were there at the right time to help these movies kind of grow a bit of a following. And Boston, which has its own little, and still does, has its own kind of midnight movie, ring of theaters. The Plaza at the Brookline had a 2-week run. And again, it's interesting to see this movie it's sort of like Rocky Horror, where it's now such a part of pop culture. Thinking that it got its start really having a hard time getting off the ground, and it took years and years for it to really get a following with people. Whereas now, if we look at the film industry, movie comes out and doesn't make money within 2 weeks, that's it. It's out of theaters. It's buried on DVD and Blu-ray, and you'll be lucky if you ever hear it from it again. The Harder They Come. This is shout out to Shout Factory for putting out a really good Blu-ray restoration of this. I'm not sure if it's going to be upgraded to 4K. I know Shout Factory rights are always a little iffy in terms of whether or not they can retain them, but the print they've got of this is pretty darn good. So this is a Jamaican film, although the man who directed it, Perry Hensel, was not Jamaican. But as is the case with a lot of Black films, even Blaxploitation movies made in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of them were directed by white directors, but these were also people who were willing to let their cast kind of do what they needed to do. And it was lost my train of thought. But again, basically not uncommon for some Blaxploitation films to have white directors. Although The Harder They Come isn't necessarily really a Blaxploitation film, it gets lumped in with it. But it's a little bit different. It's a Jamaican feature. It's got a reggae soundtrack. It's credited as the movie about reggae to the world. Don't know where like Bob Marley and stuff was at that point, so there might be some disputes on this. It was actually banned in Jamaica because the government thought it would encourage crime. But it had a good midnight run in places like Boston, in Washington, and New York City. Going back to Boston, Cambridge's Orson Welles Theater, it ran for a year and a half. The Elgin had it for 127 weeks. That's over 2 years. And Baron Holtz said, like, this movie played well with the middle class Black audiences rather than people who might have lived in like the projects in the Bronx. And it had a kind of like a lot of other movies, it had the appeal because it was something people hadn't seen before. It might not have been new to people in Jamaica, but it was new to audiences in the United States. And that's kind of the through line that we're seeing with a lot of these midnight movies is for the time, it's like, I have never seen something like this before. King of Hearts, kind of our comedy mention, well, other than Pink Flamingos, our comedy mention of the program. So this was a kind of a French, British, and I think German co-production. This was originally made in 1966. So it's a satirical comedy. It's set during 1918, it's during World War I. A soldier has to go disarm a bomb in a town, and the town is deserted, but asylum inmates who've escaped now occupy the town, and they just make this soldier their king. And it's kind of, it's both satire and also it's kind of like madcap comedy. It didn't reach the United States until the 70s, but it got a cult following because Baron Holtz, who by even 1973 had kind of made a name for himself of like, oh, he can find good movies for this kind of programming. Baron Holtz picked it up. Central Square Theater in Cambridge, it ran for 5 years, and it would share a double bill with Harold and Maude. Harold and Maude I was thinking of including, but I didn't find too much of like it was a midnight only hit because that might be just more covered in a future cult film program. Although there was a funny story that there was a theater that would play Harold and Maude and had played it for, I think, 6 years, to the point where some residents protested saying, we want another movie at this point. The Warriors. So this is an interesting case of a movie that didn't quite become a midnight film. If anything, it made some money and somewhat of a splash when it came out. So if you are not familiar with The Warriors was directed by Walter Hill. It came out in 1979. It's very loosely based on a book. It is about one gang from Coney Island. They go to this big gang gathering where there's supposed to be this leader of the Riffs named Cyrus, who says, like, how instead of us fighting, how about we band together? We control the city. We don't have to deal with organized crime. We don't have to deal with the local government. We don't have to deal with the police. And then Cyrus is shot. The Warriors are blamed, even though they didn't do it, and they have to get home. It is essentially a chase movie. And it's very highly stylized. It is one of those movies, Todd, where we've talked about it, where like it couldn't be made today. Not because there's like offensive content. It couldn't be made today because this world just doesn't exist anymore, and it would just not make sense unless you made it a period piece, which at that point, what's the point? Although at the time, it really was more of like a cartoon version of New York, New York in the 70s, not the safest place to be, but Taxi Driver is kind of a look at what New York was kind of like back then. The Warriors,
also one where they frame the movie as it's supposedly like a few years in the future of what a Taxi Driver style New York would be.
Yeah, it's again, it's kind of like a video game version of what New York could be. But it was controversial upon release because at the time in the 70s, there were gangs and gang violence, not only in New York, but in a lot of cities. And there were a lot of politicians and media pundits who were really scared that this movie was going to encourage gang violence. I don't know if this movie directly brought it on, but there were incidents of violence at screenings. So there were teens that got in a fight at Palm Springs, and there was in Dorchester, Massachusetts, there was a teen that was actually murdered. Now, there's never been any proof if the screenings caused it or if it was just people who were not getting along went to go see a movie at the same time and a fight broke out, but that really gave the movie notoriety. Paramount pulled the posters for it and even tried to pull it from theaters. And it wasn't until a few years later where there really started to be somewhat of repertory screenings. Let's go watch this again. And actually now it's a big midnight movie staple. So this is one where it got its kind of midnight movie label a little bit longer after it initially premiered. Either way, if you've not seen The Warriors, go watch that movie. That movie's a ton of fun. I love it. But I truly believe there's no other time that it could have been made than in the late 1970s. Oh, sorry. And finishing it up with our individual film examples is the 1982 film Liquid Sky. Has anyone heard of this movie? This is a movie I had not heard of until the podcast 80s All Over. And Coolidge did do a midnight showing of it. I think this was another one where it was like snow prevented us from going. So thanks, Winter. I talk you up and defend you, and you do this to me. But it was adapted from a short story, and it is a very strange film. Its narrative is odd. There's glam rock looks, there's day glow colors, there's a lot of gender fluidity, there's a main actress who plays both a male and a female role, and there's a very small alien. I can't quite say where the small alien is and what he relates to at the library program, but there is a fairly thorough summary on Wikipedia if you're looking. Again, it's a weird movie. It's got one of those synth scores. And this became a hit for the midnight crowd. It was not a mainstream hit when it came out. Granted, the director really wanted more of the art house market versus the midnight market. But by the early 80s, the art house market and the midnight market were kind of merging into one, mainly because, post Star Wars, post Jaws, the blockbusters were really taking over, and the studios were concerned with make as much money as possible versus let's have this movie just screening for 3 years. Theaters were changing because they saw we can get more money playing these blockbusters over and over versus smaller films. So this really is kind of like the last midnight movie before cinema really started to change. But luckily, because VCRs were starting to become a thing, this movie and all of these other midnight movies really had a second life on home video. So your older brother who might have gone to see Pink Flamingos in 1977 could tell you years down the line, like, oh, hey, have you ever seen this? We're going to go get it from the video store. Again, and this is, I know people love streaming, but this is why I think physical media is so important. It allows this stuff to live on versus streaming. The rights can be taken away, or it can go off Netflix or go to another service at any time, versus if you own a copy, you have it and you can lend it to somebody forever. That's why libraries having this stuff is important. So we're going to go back a little bit before the big movies. So most of the stuff I mentioned was 70s and 80s, maybe late 60s. But where the midnight movies really started was the underground scene. So stuff like the Andy Warhols of the world. But it came with a little bit more controversy than just movies being screened. So Jonah Mekas, he was a Village Voice critic. He said, this is back in the 60s, there's no other way of breaking the frozen cinematic ground than through a complete derangement of the official cinematic senses. And he also said movies like, Flaming Creatures, The Queen of Sheba Meets the Atom Man, Blonde Cobra. These are the real revolutions in cinema today. So there were theaters like the Bleecker Street Cinema, and they would show the more experimental movies. So again, this was like the Andy Warhol stuff, the really avant-garde stuff. So these are the movies that laid the groundwork for the Eraserheads, the El Topos, to be made and to be shown. One of the most famous underground midnight movies was Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures. If anything, John Waters has talked about Flaming Creatures. If you watch Flaming Creatures and watch his other movies, you're like, yep, see the connection there. Shown at Bleecker Street in the early 60s, it had nudity, it had simulated sexual relations, it had violence, and it caught the eye of the police and the moral guardians, who were very again, pearl clutching. How dare this be shown? Think of the children, even though it was a midnight showing. So it was seized by the police in 1964 as it went against obscenity laws at the time, but it had a lot of defenders. So Johan Mekas was someone who immediately came to the movie's defense, but it also had a very famous defender in Susan Sontag. So she defended it again on the larger issue of this is free expression and free speech, and we cannot let movies, which are made by adults, starring adults, and it may look crazy, but everything that's happening is above board. We can't get rid of that, or else that's a threat to free expression. And it really became a rallying cause for the underground and avant-garde film movement. Flaming Creatures you can find. I think there's actually somebody just put it up on YouTube. Again, once upon a time, this is stuff where there would be, they would actually say secret showings, or like here, it says films of Jack Smith. It'll say Flaming Creatures, but other times there'll be like a secret showcase of Jack Smith films, because if they didn't advertise it, maybe they wouldn't get in trouble, because they're like, you can't prove we were going to show it. But there would still be police that would go covertly to these screenings to try to bust them. It was again, very different time, but again, people like this breaking ground made movies like Eraserhead possible. And it would be, we can't really talk about midnight movies without talking about the queer aspect of midnight movies, because queer creators were a very vital part of underground cinema in the 60s. If you came to the queer cinema program, we talked about Kenneth Anger and Scorpio Rising. It's a short movie, and it's very strange, but it was, again, this was where the audience for it was. So as you can see here, the surprise program, that's where they would show these films. And sometimes they would not even wait until midnight. They would show them earlier. But they would have to try to get around the police or obscenity laws in some cases by not advertising what they were showing. And Jack Smith, who made Flaming Creatures, he was queer, and he is now kind of lauded as a pioneer, not just for queer cinema, but for underground cinema. I mean, of course, there's people like Andy Warhol and Kenneth Anger, but he's sort of seen as a lesser known hero. I mean, I think anyone who makes a movie and who just wanted to make a movie to express themselves and it gets busted by police, I'm like, yeah, you're doing a great thing. Again, as long as there's nothing actually wrong in there, I'm like, it's a movie, leave it alone. And if we're going to modern day, there are queer films that still kind of have the midnight circuit appeal. Priscilla, Queen of the Desert in the 90s, actually in Australia and in the US in repertory theaters, did have a little bit of a mini midnight following. And Hedwig and the Angry Inch, John Cameron Mitchell's film, definitely that got like the Rocky Horror crowd. Both great movies if you haven't seen them. So we're moving on to modern midnight movies. It's kind of our segue. So we do have some newer films. Donnie Darko has kind of become a midnight movie. Showgirls, which I have been to a midnight screening of. Wild Zero, which if you are not familiar with this film, it is a Japanese zombie film. It's a lot of fun. And The Big Lebowski. Big Lebowski, Donnie Darko, Showgirls, all movies that didn't do that, like kind of following these other movies, didn't do that well when they came out. They found their little audience, and that audience just follows them wherever. And they have their repertory screening. So I mean, yeah, as I said earlier, in New York, a lot of those small theaters are no longer there, or they've been bought up by bigger chains. And I mean, most movie theaters you go to, they're chains now. However, there are still independent theaters who are showing midnight shows, or if they can't show midnight shows, they'll try to show repertory screenings of these. So the midnight movie is alive in some way. It's a little bit different now, but if we're talking about distance, there's always been kind of a city feature for it. So I don't think that's really changed, but in terms of the availability, it's definitely shrunk a bit, but it survives. So there was in 2008, a little movie called Repo the Genetic Opera. It's fine. There's a couple songs in there that are pretty good. And it was made not entirely to get the Rocky Horror Picture Show crowd. I do want to give the man who made it credit. This was an idea that he had. He really wanted to make this movie, but in interviews he had talked about, he goes like, I want to be the next Rocky Horror Picture Show. This is going to be the next like cult hit. And to give Repo credit, there is a following for Repo the Genetic Opera. But as Baron Holtz said earlier, you cannot create a cult film. Audiences have to choose the cult film, and audiences did not choose Repo as the cult film midnight movie of the new millennium. Instead, they chose a little movie made by a very strange man called Tommy Wiseau. Yes, this is the poster for this movie. This was actually a billboard too. I kid you not, this is as I say, Todd, we're actually doing good on time, so we have enough time to share all of our room stories. So where to begin with the room? Todd, where do we start?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Do we start
I think
with who Tommy Wiseau is?
Well, that to borrow a line from Gene Wilder, well, Tommy Wiseau is not really a who, he's more of a what.
Yeah. Nobody knows where Tommy Wiseau is from, how old he is, how he got his money. But he was, and this is coming from Greg Sestero, who is in the room, and he wrote a book called The Disaster Artist, which is about the making of the movie. He met Tommy Wiseau in an acting class, and as far as he could tell, and he still kind of sticks to this, Tommy Wiseau sincerely wanted to make a Tennessee Williams style movie of betrayal and heartbreak. And he made a mess. It's a mess. This movie is ineptly made.
It's a fascinating train wreck.
It is. Tommy Wiseau had so much faith in this movie, faith that could only be qualified as delusional. He had it play in 2 Hollywood theaters for 2 weeks so it could qualify for the Oscars. And this is 2003. He also took out a billboard, again, featuring his face and that type. And it did not get a lot of traction when it premiered. But in comedy circles in LA, so people like Paul Rudd and David Cross kind of started to talk about, like, have you seen this movie? And the term so bad it's good got thrown around a lot with this. And also, again, you have to see it to believe it.
I actually kind of remember, as a minor extension of the Midnight Movie Factor, Adult Swim, every April 1st for a few years there, they would play an edited version of this at midnight.
Yep. So again, going back to what midnight movies originally were, showing cheesy movies at midnight, just full circle here. You gotta love it. It started to gain following in comedy circles, and then they started hosting screenings. And like Rocky Horror, it eventually built into this full-blown phenomenon. To the point where, was it 2010 or 2009 where we went to go see, I think our first screening was 2009.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And then in 2010, there was a screening where it was like Tommy Wiseau live and in person, and you bet we went. And so Tommy Wiseau has tried to revise his history of The Room. It was marketed for a while as the greatest comedy of all time. He's tried to go like, oh no, I wanted to make a comedy. That's a lie. That's a dang lie.
He's tried to make comedies since then, and they have not had anywhere near the impact.
100% a lie. This man was sincere as a heart attack making this movie. And when we saw him, and this was at the Coolidge Corner Theater in Brookline, Massachusetts, that's when it really hit to me. Because when I'd seen this movie, I'm like, is this real? Was this intentional? When I saw this man, I was like, oh, it's not a joke. Oh my God. Like, someone asked him what his inspiration is, like cinematic inspiration. He goes like, that's a stupid question. That's like me asking you what inspires you to eat breakfast every morning. And then he had a woman, he wears a lot of belts. He wears a ton of belts, and he had this poor woman come and count his belts. And I really wanted to call the police at that moment. He's a weird dude.
There is a reason, there is a popular theory that he is the end result of Andy Kaufman faking his death and assuming this persona.
Yeah, there's still a lot of like Greg Sestero has maintained. He's like, no, Tommy made this movie in all sincerity. This was not made to be a comedy. This was a very bad movie that happened to get a following of people. And you know what? Hey, it all worked out well for Tommy Wiseau and Greg Sestero. I mean, they're both famous now. But do not let anyone ever try to tell you this was made to be a comedy. It was not. Um, but The Room, like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, probably has a as of now, the most recognizable like call and responses. So it's set in San Francisco. Whenever you have a you would have a shot, like there'd be a lot of stock footage of San Francisco. So every time you saw all those famous houses, people will start to sing the Full House theme song, which R.I.P. Bob Saget. Whenever there's shots of the Golden Gate Bridge, people will yell, go, 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 go. People used to throw spoons in footballs. Why footballs? Because there's a really weird scene where people are playing footballs in tuxedos. Why the spoons? Because there's very strange, came with the frame pictures of spoons, framed photos of spoons. Many theaters have actually said, please don't throw footballs and spoons because you could potentially damage the screen. Also, it's a lot to clean up. Theaters, Todd, if you want to talk about what the crackdown has been for some of the stuff at the Room, because we've seen it.
So I'm gonna be honest, as far as the crackdowns, we've more been there for like the second hand. Like there was the time we went to a midnight showing of Lucio Fulci's The Beyond, where they had us in the upstairs theater, and Mark was explaining, you're gonna hear some noise from the downstairs. They're playing The Room. I don't really like this kind of a crowd, but this is what lets me show movies like this. So please bear with it.
Well, but there has been for, again, late aughts, early 2010s. We've evolved a little bit since then, but there used to be like pretty misogynistic language towards the character of Lisa, and a lot of theater owners have been like, can we not do that? It's getting a little intense here.
Yeah,
I know there's that, but the big one that we've had a lot of people say when we were at the Avon in Connecticut, which is where we met Jamie, by the way. We met her at a Room screening, which is the most perfect meeting ever. They were like, please do not throw footballs. We have screens here. But yeah, it is currently the reigning champion of midnight movies of the new millennium. And it really is, I think, in terms of like the old stories of the movies, it's the biggest success story. A movie that came out, no one paid attention to it. It bombed in every way possible. And now it has a special place in a whole lot of people's hearts. And so what is the future of Midnight? Again, The Room is the reigning champion. Unfortunately, cinema looks a lot different now. So the possibility of these weird little movies coming to theaters, that's not as possible. In a lot of cases, smaller independent films are going straight to on demand. I will say support your local independent theater. I know at the very least, there's the Red River up in Concord. They are doing amazing work. There's a lot of good independent theaters in Boston. There's the Somerville Theater. There's Coolidge Corner in Brookline. There's the Brattle. Support these places, whatever you have to do, because they are really keeping this trend alive. Because I know AMC isn't doing midnight showings anymore. Even the midnight premieres for like popular movies went away in like the mid 2010s.
Yeah, it kind of got supplanted by the Thursday night showing.
Yep. Well, I mean, you know what? We all got to work in the morning, so I don't mind a Thursday night showing. The only thing I could say for what the future is Mark Anastasio is doing a lot of great Coolidge Midnights, but he is trying to, in his words, kill the Room with Tom Hooper's Cats as the new midnight show. It's nice to know that movie might be good for something.
Well, I mean, that was actually one where right out of the gate, it built a following as a seeing is believing train wreck. So
it is, and that's really what the through line with a lot of these midnight movies. It's the seeing is believing factor, and experiencing something so radically weird with a group of people rather than just by yourself. It's the joy of everyone experiencing it at once. And with that, I'll stop sharing and go to questions. All right, does anyone have any questions? All right, well, if that is the case, we hope to see you next month. It's going to be February 14th for Melvin Van Peebles. I hope you guys will have as much fun learning about him as I did. And March, I think it's March 14th as well for Ida Lupino. And April might be up in the air. Long story short, I might be going to Arizona. My grandmother's turning 102, but I don't know when. I have a vague idea of when it's going to be, but we're still trying to figure out when we're going. So thank you everyone for coming, and I will see you all next month.